Okay, can you see my screen?
Oh, look at that. Yep. You're not in presenter mode if there, oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, welcome back to the second morning session. We continue with our AI theme. We have our next speaker, Bujji Selagamsetty, all the way from the University of Wisconsin. Is presenting remotely today and be talking about applications of AI in high throughput computing. So thank you.
Thanks for the intro. As you mentioned, my name is Bujji. I'm currently co-advised by Professors Joshua San Miguel and Professor Mikola Pasti, both out of the ECE department. And today I'm going to talk about some of our work in this direction of contouring the audio fovea and kind of describing the audio fovea with Pinna cues for spatial speech perception. So, very quickly, I'm going to go over the motivation for this kind of work. I'm going to talk about some of the past work we've done in this area and how we've used CHTC to kind of get those initial results. Then I'm going to talk about what we're currently working on, and then I'll end with some tips and tricks I've learned from using CHTC, as well as some wish list items I have as well for hoping for the future from CHTC as well. Okay, so motivation. So, from the title, there's a lot of buzzwords in there, so I'm going to try to break it down into piece by piece here. So the key task that we're looking at is this speech denoising task, where you have this audio signal that carries some important characteristics that you want to focus on, namely speech, and it could also include some characteristics that you don't want to focus on, like noise. And you can think about that as like a fan noise going on overhead, or an ambulance siren going on the side, or something like that. So the goal is to build a system that can take this type of noisy input audio and remove the noise while preserving or even amplifying the speech itself. And so for our work, we look primarily at the neuroscience behind this, because our brain is actually or our anatomy and our brain is pretty good at doing this. On the pre-processing side, we look at the pinna, which is your outer ear, and try to replicate how the pinna transforms input audio signals to be able to make teasing apart the speech and noise a little bit easier once it makes it into the neuronal circuitry in your brain. Then again, trying to leverage this idea of like bio-inspired, going after the energy efficiency that we see in the brain, we try to replicate this behavior using shallow spiking neural networks. And spiking neural networks, for those of you that don't know, are mainly they're a different flavor of neural networks, in which case where we just, instead of representing the inputs as like regular floats or integers or like discrete values, we represent them as a spike in the time domain. So this helps us get after some of that energy efficiency that we see in the brain, because we believe that this is how signals process in the brain as well. So that's just motivation behind it. So some of the past work that we've done in this has been pretty successful. So on the left here, if some of you remember my talk from last year about this, on the left, I kind of show what is the effect of just the pinna alone on this like noisy speech audio. And you can see that like it's pretty intuitive that like when speech is in front and noise is in the back, your pinna does some pretty good passive denoising performance here. You can see that by the bright spot in the bottom right of the leftmost graph. And then, conversely, if speech is behind you but noise is in front, you get pretty poor denoising performance, because the noise is like what's being amplified by the pinna. On the right, I show some results that we used where we were able to train the spiking neural network, where we had the audio pre-processed by the pinna. I'm not going to get too much into the details about what happens here. All that you really need to know is that like the spiking neural network was able to pick up on features that we do see in biology as well, which is pretty cool, I think, as well. And just to plug here, we see this work was recently accepted into Neuro-Inspired Computational Elements, or NICE 2025, earlier this year. Okay, so that's what we did in the past, and here's kind of the setup that we used CHTC to be able to generate those results. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this if you've used CHTC, but the idea is that from our laptop we connect to the submit server. We're able to submit our training jobs directly to the GPU lab. Because we have a pretty large data set, we were storing our speech and noise audio on the CHTC large file system, namely in the staging directory. And then we were using a Docker image to be able to have all of our dependencies and packages run on CHTC. So the flow is pretty much, submit a job, it'll pull from Docker Hub to pull our image to run on the GPUs that we want. We'll start initiating this transfer of copying over the data set from the file system, or the large file system, over to our execution point. And then we'll pull our repository down, which has all of our model, like the source code for all of our spiking neural network models and whatnot. And this is kind of the training paradigm that we had for this prior work. And it worked reasonably well for the most parts. But we also did some like meta studies to kind of understand, are we getting the most out of the GPU lab? Are we getting the most out of the GPUs once we are running and whatnot? And so some of these results kind of just do a little broad characterization of those jobs that we had ran for the prior work. So for those of you that are familiar with GPU jobs, there's kind of a key feature that you have to describe in your submit file when you're running a GPU job, and namely that's how long of a GPU job do you want to run. And so as far as I know, there's 4 options that you could choose. You could choose a short running job, which is supposed to complete in 12 hours, a medium length job, which is supposed to complete in 24 hours, a medium long job, which is 3 days, and a long job, which is 7 days. And what I was noticing is that there's a lot of variance in this data set transfer time. So remember, we're trying to move the data set, which is about 250 gigs from the large file system to our execution point before we can even begin training. And I do this using Linux explicit move commands. So, for each of the jobs, you can see here that the amount of time it takes to transfer this large data set is significantly large and, varies quite a bit over all of the jobs that we looked at in these specific categories. And the maximum amount actually ends up being pretty significant of your total GPU slot provision. So what I show here is you can see that this blue portion is basically the dataset transfer time, and that's taking up this sizable percentage, maybe only like 10%, less than 10%, which isn't huge, but it is problematic because it's unpredictable. And so one thing you have to do with your jobs is you have to be able to say like, I want to run training for maybe this many epochs or maybe this many samples and whatnot, and then stop and create a checkpoint. But the problem is if your data set transfer time takes too long, then maybe your training will now go past your slot boundary and you won't be able to save your checkpoint before you get kicked off the GPU machine. So that's kind of what this stat over here says, where out of the 4,000 short or 4,700 short jobs that I launched, 170 of them actually surpassed their job limit and were kicked out before they could save a checkpoint. So, a solution to this is to try to be super conservative and say like, okay, I'm only going to run maybe 1 epoch or maybe 2 epochs of training. But then this, underutilizes the job slot that you're looking for because 1, you're spending all this time waiting to get allocated onto a GPU. Then you spend all this time transferring your data set. And then if you're only going to run for maybe 1 or 2 epochs, you're yielding all this time back to the system, which, you just spent all this time waiting. You may as well use all your GPU hours that you were just given. So these are kind of some of the hurdles that we were trying to tackle. Another, and so that's one variable. The other variable is each GPU kind of processes elements differently. As you understand, or as you would imagine, the higher end, newer GPUs can process the same amount of data much faster. So they can actually do much more work in the amount of time that you're given. So you need to be, so an issue we were facing is how do we try to take advantage of this fact? And so we came up with these kind of approaches that kind of address some of these problems. So on the first hand, when we're talking about like dealing with the variables that are beyond our control, like dataset transfer time and knowing when the job ends and whatnot, we leverage this tool called HTChirp, which basically allows your job when it runs to pull the job add information and be able to tell like, okay, I have 5 more hours left. I know that training an epoch takes about an hour, or maybe it takes like half an hour or something like that. So yeah, I can train maybe 10 or maybe 9 more epochs and then save a checkpoint. And so that's what I'm showing here. And as you can see, yeah, the dataset transfer time is still pretty high. We've done some other things to kind of deal with that problem, but the more important result is that this yellow portion, the amount of yielded time, has gone down significantly, which means that we're able to use most of the GPU hours in our GPU slot as we can, which is great. That's what we want. The other aspect too is like we did a characterization on the types of GPUs our jobs got slotted into, and we were able to come up with the right hyperparameter configurations to be able to get as much performance out of them as we can. So as you can see here in the blue, that's what we were doing old, where we just launch everything with the same batch size, the same number of CPU threads, the same number of threads doing prefetching for the data set. And you get decent performance, but then once you start tuning to machine-specific architectures, you can see that the amount of time it takes to compute an epoch goes way down. And it just shows that like CHTC has a lot of different types of GPUs, and it's advantageous for you to try to take advantage of that in machine-specific ways. The missing data is just because we never got slotted onto those machines again after we made these changes. Okay, so that's background, previous stuff, all that stuff we've already done. All those insights are a little bit old now. I'm going to talk about our current work. So this work that we had kind of inspired us to look a little bit more deeply into figuring out what is this like spatial map of audio that the brain can perceive. So, I showed that kind of 2D heat map earlier where we say like noise in the front, speech is in the back, but that was a very constrained model where we were only looking at one specific azimuth where speech and noise could be. But really what we want to do is we want to characterize the entire 3D space so we can say like, okay, yeah, speech definitely is better if it comes from here, and noise is definitely attenuated very well if it comes from over here. And so we want to know like where are those positions and how quickly is the drop off in perceptibility when these things change in location. And then, a stretch goal after that, or not a stretch goal, but the next thing after that is, okay, how can we use this information to kind of create these more immersive and personalized spatial audio experiences? So a bit about our methodology now. It's very similar to the one before. I just didn't present the numbers earlier, so now I'm presenting them now. So we're using this database that has these transforms for the Pinna. And what's cool is that they have a relatively fine granularity for their sampling. So they take 25 different azimuths and then 50 different elevations. So you have 12,000 or 1,250 different orientations where you could simulate audio coming from. So this gives us a pretty good or a pretty fine mesh to determine the contour map of spatial audio perceptibility. We use about 500 hours of noisy speech data. So this includes like 500 hours of clean speech, 500 hours of noise speech. We synthesize them together to create noisy speech, and then the denoised output, what we had previously done was what was working off of that. In this case, we're just keeping the two separate, and we're saying, okay, let's put speech here, noise here, speech here, noise here, speech here, noise here, and see, like what is the effect of just using the Pinna. So we're not training any more neural networks. We're just kind of doing a task that's, I guess, analogous to like inferencing tasks, but we're not inferencing. We're just running a passive kind of sweep thing. So, our compute requirements are very extensive. We're trying to generate almost 1 million data points or more than 1 million data points, and each one must consume over 500 hours to kind of give us robust and interpretable results. So it's a lot of data we're trying to crunch. So now our flow is slightly updated. Recently, CHTC has kind of been beta testing this new feature of using Research Drive rather than staging. So rather than having our data set solely on, /staging, we also have a copy on Research Drive, and we're in the process of migrating to using that flow entirely. But otherwise, our flow is pretty much the same. We still have an image on Docker Hub that's pulled to run, and that installs all the packages or sets up an environment with all the packages we need. We still pull our project from the repo to be able to use our scripts and whatnot to do this type of evaluation. And nicely, since we're not training anymore, our data set requirements are also a little bit smaller because we're only using a subset of them now. One thing that we did improve upon is rather than using explicit move commands, we use the inbuilt CHTC like transfer input files to directly transfer from either staging or from Research Drive, which I don't have a nice little graph like I did earlier, but this is much more reliable and much faster than using explicit move commands. So this has been a huge help for us as well, or a huge benefit for us. So, okay, like I said, we have a ton of data that we're trying to crunch. Here I have the latest snapshot of the results in progress. So as you can imagine, we're trying to build that same type of graph that we saw earlier, but in a much more detailed and a much more extensive dimensionality here. And as you can see, it is in progress. We try to do a couple different approaches where some jobs will tackle just like, focusing on a specific quadrant. Some jobs will try to do this sampling over, the whole area to give us a more general sense. While most of them go in row major order, we try some jobs having go column major just to be able to give us different data points. That way we can look at them in aggregate. Additionally, we're also like leveraging CPUs here because, again, we're not doing really training, so CPUs can still be useful here as well. And you can see that those jobs kind of complete up here doing a lot smaller progressions, whereas the GPU jobs are able to do a lot more at once they complete. So a thing about this is, or a note about this is that we had to take specific steps to kind of avoid this kind of work duplication. So we have a lot of different things going on in parallel, right? We have short jobs that are running on a specific region. We have medium jobs that are going on a different region, maybe medium long jobs, long deep jobs, and then CPU jobs. And we want to make sure that none of these are computing the same results because, I mean, that's a waste of compute resources and time, right? So what we do is we basically tell all the jobs that before they start, look at what's already been completed, and then based on what you were scheduled to do, remove those ones that are completed and only do the ones that are not complete. So basically, like if I told one of the jobs to like do all of the computation in this little bounding box in the center here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the center. It'll go through and we'll see that, okay, some of these jobs are completed. Let's ignore those and we'll only fill in these black portions here. So that was pretty cool. Took a little bit of setup, but I think it is better for our perspective because one, we're not wasting time. We can get our results a little bit faster. And two, we're not wasting CPU cycles or GPU cycles as well. So, as you can imagine, this data doesn't really look that interesting. It's kind of hard to understand what's going on. And it's not the best way to view this. So what we actually do is we look at it in aggregate, and this is kind of the more exciting piece of the work because you can actually or you can understand it more tangibly. So what we have here is up in the top, I've plotted these now in the 3D audio space, and you can see that brighter spots correspond to better denoising results, whereas darker spots correspond to poor or worse denoising results. And so in the upper plot, I'm aggregating to say, okay, where is the best place I could put speech, regardless of where noise is coming from? And as you imagine, since we're looking at the right ear, it comes from this upper right region here. And then the other bottom plot looks at the noise counterpart. So where is the place where putting noise has the best effects? Like where can it be most easily removed? And as you can imagine, it's in this back left portion. But you also see that like the most distractful place or the worst place noise could come from is not exactly the same place as the best place the speech can come from. So there's some interesting insights that we want to tease apart and look a little more closely at between these two plots to understand like why don't they line up perfectly? What is it about noise? What is it about speech that causes this kind of interesting mix between each other here? So very quickly, my CHTC summary here. I strongly recommend including, like when you're building your Docker image and whatnot, you include the Python package htcondor, and then you set want.io proxy to true in your submit files. This way you can use HTChirp, and you can pull the job info, and then you can also like use this to update your log files. That way, while your job is progressing, sometimes you don't get the output file unless your job completes successfully, but here you can actually update the log file that's generated to send messages from your scripts directly, which has been super helpful in debugging, I think, from my perspective. As I mentioned, using the transfer input files in your submit file rather than using like explicit move commands in your script, huge help, much faster, much more reliable. We had some issues. We had some issues getting ported over to the research drive flow, but now that it's mostly working, I found it to be much more stable than the using slash staging. Mainly this is because staging seems to have some concurrency limitations on waiting to access the data, and sometimes a job would just quit if it's unable to successfully initiate a transfer after a certain amount of time. Lastly, definitely reach out to the CHTC support staff. They've been super helpful. Special thanks to Ian Ross, Andrew Owen, and Emberlin for helping set up with GPUs, Research Drive, and really any of my CHTC questions. And lastly, just really quickly, some wish list items that I'd hope to see for in CHTC from the future. Really hoping to see GPU diversity. Would love to see some AMD GPUs out there just to be able to do some profiling on those. Would love to have more configurability so that jobs can communicate with other jobs, especially if they're slotted on the same machine. And I'd love to have a little bit more detail in the report on, how did I use my GPU? Did I use it efficiently? Was I getting enough compute out of it? Was it memory bound? Stuff like that. And that's all that I have. Thank you. I'll take questions too now. Sorry.
Thank you. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Any questions for Bujji? I'm sorry, the microphone's a long way away.
Hey, Bujji, it's Ian. So I'm just curious, the very final point there about GPU monitoring. have you considered using any of the, weights and biases or something like that? Or would that provide the insight if you build that logic into your application, or are you come more interested systems level directly from HT Condor type stuff?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm more interested from the system level because I already know that my model, like a spiky neural network, is a bad model for training in general, but I want to make it better so I can find better ways to train spiky neural networks. So I think I need more of a system level perspective. And so the work I've done is kind of like looking at the PyTorch profiler to tell me a little bit of information, but it's a little bit too coarse for anything that's really helpful. So I'm looking into like getting Nsight compute built into one of my Docker images so I can actually see like, okay, what is my SM occupancy? What is my SM utilization and stuff like that?
Cool. Thanks. Yeah. We could definitely think about a advanced user mode with all the bells and whistles.
Yeah, that would be super cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions for Bujji? No? Well, let's thank our speaker again.
Thanks for having me.